Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Let's return to the issue of internet giant Google's tax bill. Of course, it's not just Google. We'll come on to that. But earlier in the programme, I spoke to Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell. I asked him what would he do to make sure that companies like Google pay a fair and appropriate level of tax.
First of all, I want the information about how this deal was arrived at. And I want them in future to be able to publish their, well, the tax records, so that we can all have
the British part of the tax records.
Yes, of course, yes, so that we can have openness and transparency. We can see what's fair, what's just. The Chancellor came out and said this was a major success, but we can't tell because we haven't got the information.
John McDonnell speaking to me earlier. Jen, and I would suggest that the Google row rumbles on, helped by Google appearing with Andrew Marr this morning. There are other companies in the frame similar to Google, like Amazon, Apple, big investigation by the European Commission into their tax bill. And we discover that a lot of major British multinationals don't pay any or very small amounts of corporation tax. This issue has got a long way to go, I would suggest.
Yeah, and it could end up in a transatlantic, almost Cold War between the EU and the US, and in particular US companies, because each side thinks the other is trying to exploit its side disproportionately. And I wondered that whether eventually the people who will ultimately lobby for international corporate tax reform and clarity will be corporations themselves, because at the moment they're getting into trouble for what is ultimately observing the letter of the law and certainly observing their fiduciary duty to pay the legal minimum of tax, the duty they have to their shareholders. If that's getting them into trouble, then I think they have an incentive in the long term to press for clarity and reform internationally, even if it means their aggregate tax payment goes slightly upwards.
The irony is that this row comes after there's been major changes at the OECD level, at the EU level, on trying to simplify and get multinationals to pay their due tax. And yet we seem to be no further forward than before, despite all that. I wonder whether people are going to start looking hard at whether corporation tax itself is the right way to proceed.
I think there are other ways of doing it. It's true, you can do it on sales, you can do it on turnover, but what's quite plain is that these large companies that are taking bigger and bigger slabs of the British markets are not paying their tax, and one way or other they have to. Think of the people who are competing against Amazon. You know, whether you're Argos or whether you're John Lewis or
the local bookshop.
Or the local bookshop. It is just not fair, and I think their sense of indignation, and then to discover that the Conservative Party, while talking about this government, while talking about how they're trying to clean this up and they're doing more than Labour, which possibly they are, meanwhile instructing their MEPs to vote against moves in Europe, to try to get a proper European agreement on this. It's not going to work unless we get a European agreement. And to find out that the government says one thing speaking here, but secretly in the European Parliament does something else. I think there's a lot of legs in this. I think a lot of trouble for the Conservative Party because it plays to their weakness, just as security and defence plays to Labour's weakness. This plays to a core weakness. They're in bed with the big corporations and they don't really want to get a grip on this.
Do you think they are in bed with them, though? I mean, there's no evidence that they've had all these meetings. Politicians love meeting so-called cutting-edge companies. They don't spend that much time with steel companies, but they'll spend it with Google and Apple and all the rest. It's a bit of a stretch to then think that they were ever doing anything about Google's tax return at these meetings.
I think it's quite a stretch. It's been right, you know, Steve Hilton, married to Google top executive, right at the heart of Downing Street, just as Andy Coulson from the Murdoch Empire was right at the heart of Downing Street. I think this is very risky.
Seamus Milne at the heart of the Corbyn Empire.
Well, indeed, but they're not actually in power. There's quite a difference
no, they're not.
between being in power and
but they want to be. But they,
well, a lot of people want to be.
It is ironic that after the international rules were meant to be cleaned up, they were meant to have done something about the double Irish and the Dutch sandwich. I speak in tongues because that's how you have to do it these days. But they haven't been, and it will take, unless there's a major radical change, I would suggest, if they carry on the current way, it'll be another 10 years before there are further changes that solve this issue.
Yes, and not only were the international rules meant to be cleared up, George Osborne, almost every budget he stands up and says, obviously we're going to crack down on tax evasion, but talked about how reprehensible aggressive tax avoidance is, talking very, very strongly, and then last week says that this deal with Google is a special deal. I think the problem for George Osborne, he's sort of forgotten the second part of Peter Mandelson's famous sentence, which is we're very relaxed about people getting very, very rich, ... as long as they pay their tax.
Yes.
And he sort of forgot about that. And I think the problem for George Osborne is that he sees everything through a sort of a 2010 lens. And the 2010 lens is, well, this deal is much better than anything that happened under New Labour. But the thing is, that's 6 years ago. We've moved on from that.
And governments were finding their way against companies like Google.
Exactly,
Google
and
back in
people are now
2005.
judging this government on what they've done, and it looks inadequate.
And it's been a long, slow burger campaign. If you think of the tax justice campaign, it's been brilliant. UK Uncut ran fantastic demonstrations, clever, witty, sharp, against Topshop, against Vodafone, against Boots, people who are avoiding their taxes in elaborate ways. And by witty campaigns that the public saw, it's come into public consciousness.
Oh, I think it's at the centre of it now. And as I say, with other cases coming up, Apple and Amazon, Vodafone is always in the frame for these things, all using European low tax. Just finally on this, I thought it was fascinating that Peter Barron of Google this morning explained, in effect, that the money that's made in Britain and other places is then sent to Bermuda, essentially warehoused in Bermuda. Why? Well, Bermuda's a tax haven, but if they repatriated it back to Californian headquarters, they'd pay corporation tax in America, and they think that's too high.
Well,
So all the governments are suffering from this.
Well, American corporate tax, if you add in every single level, I think is round about 40%, which is why Apple have about $200 billion in cash reserves internationally.
They've all got it outside. All right, let's move on the referendum. I know we're going to be talking about this a lot. I got the impression, again, from listening to John McDonnell and other Labour shadow ministers I've interviewed, that actually there is no appetite, I don't think, on the Labour front bench to delay this referendum. I think they would like just to get on with it.
They want to get on with it. They want it to succeed. They want the Yes campaign to win. At the moment, Labour's not doing very well with it, because it ought to be a great sort of hallmark for them that Labour is almost, apart from one or two very fringy people, almost unequivocally pro-EU. And they should be making a lot of capital against a very split Tory party. And they're not really.
Well,
it isn't quite clear why.
Maybe their hearts are not in it. After all, it's led by two people who voted to come out in 75.
I don't think it is just that. 'Cause they've got Alan Johnson leading the Labour campaign, and he doesn't really seem to be making much headway. I mean, maybe they're just waiting till Cameron comes back with a package, but I think they're missing a trick here.
You see, Steve Baker this morning said that he wanted it later. The Eurosceptics want more time. They fear if it's rushed in, they're definitely going to lose. But to stop a June referendum in the Commons, it would need... The Scottish Nationalists are up for a fight in this, but it would need Labour too. If you don't have Labour, the government gets it through.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's clearly not going to happen. I mean, the only thing I think that could stop it, because the numbers there are now not in the Commons, is if the Electoral Commission, bearing in mind that you've now got the leaders of the three devolved administrations, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, saying they're not happy with the June referendum because it's so close to their elections in May. That's the only thing that could potentially stop it. But now that the Labour Party is saying we should get on with it, then it looks like that will happen. And I mean, obviously, people like Steve Baker need to be careful, because they have been saying for 20 years we need to have a referendum.
Bring it on.
Here it is coming down the stream, and they're saying, oh, we're not sure about it, which potentially shows that they're nervous about the case that they want to make.
I thought the most telling thing Steve Baker said was that the number of Tory MPs who will vote to leave, I think, would be no more than 70 he was budgeting for, which is clearly expectations management on his part. And what you've seen over the past 72 hours is expectations management by both sides. So number 10 talking about this emergency brake on benefits that's clearly a bit less than they expect to extract in the summit in the middle of February. So now they're dampening down expectations. They come in slightly above, and we're all massively impressed when it happens.
Are you
I
telling
hope
me
you're
that
right that he's that clever. What worries me is that he's been very reckless in these negotiations, has put things out there that he could never get, has not got everybody squared before suggesting things. I hope you're right.
If not clever, then certainly cynical. And on the other side, on the outside, Steve Baker and the sceptics are clearly playing down their expected numbers as to the number of Tory MPs, even cabinet ministers, who'll eventually vote.
But it's interesting for George Osborne, the area where he thinks you will make the most fundamental and important change are the protections for those countries that are not in the Eurozone to ensure that they can't be out-caucused in the rules on the single market.
And that's
by
a
the
very
Eurozone.
little coverage.
And that gets very, and George Osborne says that is the most important thing we could get because it'll play for decades to come. But the territory that they're fighting on is the area where they're quite weak, which are potentially these benefit reforms.
Because we'll have another referendum, probably 2021, won't we, when treaty change takes place and the Eurozone becomes a proper monetary union?
I don't think anybody's going to do any treaty change for a very long time. The mood right across Europe, for a whole lot of different fractious reasons, but particularly about immigration and refugees. I think nobody will want a treaty. It's all big talk.
Even
and
after
anybody
the French
says,
and German elections?
no, I don't see it, because I don't think anybody will trust their own electorate sufficiently at any particular point. They'll look at ours with great interest.
And they'd say, don't go there.
And I think so.
I think
Don't go there.
I think you're probably right.